Hello, 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 and welcome to. Hello, 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 and welcome to. Hello, 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 and welcome to. Pop Cartoon. Kabbalah, 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 Kabbalah. Coming at you live from the Ala Valley. I never expected Superman to be meaningful or relevant ever again. But I also, for quite a while, have been aware of the potential. Most of the most profound developments of the Superman concept since the original creators were phased off it back in the 40s and 50s have mostly been stand-ins, characters who function as Superman, but for legal and social reasons can never be called that and have to be different somehow. Now, in the 70s, and I think even earlier, the owners of Superman, before they were the full Warner, when they were just DC, sued, I think it was the name of the company, I don't think it was Charleston, but whoever made Captain Marvel, because it was too similar. The aesthetic was a ripoff of Superman, even though the entire story and description of what the character is almost diametrically the opposite. Not an alien, but a child. Not, aliens, but magic. All the things that thematically and aesthetically. But there you go. Aesthetically, short black hair and a cape. Oh, I want that when it's close enough. And it's designed a little bit to be close enough in the hope that someone will just buy it, and the money to spend on the other thing when there wasn't enough Superman comics and the kids just Jones for just pictures of a dude flying with his chest wide, sort of hand up in the air, and they're just so chilled out by it and suddenly like happy and excited and dreaming of better things and identifying with some genuinely viable morality, let's call it, some genuinely, but really fantasy. Because here's the thing, right? Really has emerged this year, and with this Superman incarnation, more than any other, has emerged how much early and original Superman really had very different goals than any of the sort of famous and televised Supermans. Really, no Superman has ever had moral goals quite on the level of the original 1938 Superman of Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster. I wish I knew their Hebrew names offhand. I would say them pretentiously, but no, I don't know their names. They are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Jerry Siegel wrote and Joe Shuster drew. And Joe Shuster was kept around longer because he had less dignity and made less demands and was happy just to have any work at all. So they just put him on the comic strip adaptation, one of the sort of lower end side investments, while taking them off the main comic. And, other very talented people, given a chance at bat. But the bat depended on a different sense of priorities. Let's say, this happened with Dylan a little bit, right? Dylan starts out, the thing that makes his music popular is its radicalism, things at times a change. And it becomes so important then to make sure that if there is to be an enduring Dylan figure, that he not be so radical, but that he's mostly singing love songs, just pivots really hard into lay up on my big brand, and just much less connected and much more overtly, acceptable fantasy, Superman's pivot is to managing his girlfriend's impulses to just get him to do stuff and not do other stuff, like a child, right? But initially, he's attacking real estate developers, corrupt politicians, polluters, rich people who are somehow abusing or taking advantage of poor people, including bad motorists, including sort of like anyone who seems untouchable, specifically the wealth itself. Now, Lex Luthor returns to functioning in this role in the 80s when just the cartoonish sort of romanticization and validation of wealth really seemed to need to concentrate itself into an appropriate villain. Now, famously, most 80s and post 80s incarnations of Lex Luthor were very much inspired by the current sitting president, even though Luthor's presidency was really more itself inspired by George W. Bush. They didn't really imagine. I wonder if it's the other way around, where the presidency of Lex Luthor, convinced the big orange man in chief that, like, oh, if you can do it, anyone can. But the problem of isolating the vilification in individual figures rather than in general social phenomena raised the problem of realizing Superman, which is revolution. Let's say they do it, and then what happens? So we've discussed very early on in Pop Cartoon Kabbalah, in the context of solstice, in the context of Cancer, the downward pivot that happens with power, where, specifically sort of shining sun identified radiant which I do think of as the Superman model. Superman is nothing if not solar. Superman is very solar. Superman is so solar. And one of the many testimonials to this, besides that his power comes directly from the yellow sun, and that's his whole thing, to the degree that became canon, how much the sun really is the thing that gives him the capacity to be Superman. And it's the reason he's so special on Earth when he's not in Krypton. I almost said heaven. Krypton. Superman as Apollonian to me is very Gemini. Let's say the space between Hercules and Apollo, between like Samson and fantasy itself of the application of principles and just capacity, this is the degree to which the Apollonian is more about perspective than actualization. And part of the real difference between Apollo and Mars, right? Between the sun and the thing that's just a little drier than the sun, little further from Earth and less grounded than even the sun. Because the difference between Mars and Apollo is a little liminal and soft. So much so that I think when they're trying to describe Egyptian and Babylonian divinities in a sort of Hellenistic context as like paralleling the same guys, they're a little ambivalent about whether Horus is more like a Mars or more like an Apollo. They basically give him Apollo as Apollo evolves into a central figure and a central solar figure, just like Horus. But it's a funny example in the Egyptian, because the Egyptian cosmology is everybody's got to be the sun. You're not God if you're not the sun, and the moon. You got to be both, or you're not even nothing. You have to go through them in the big cycle, but you also represent the entire thing. And it's like, it's proven by the kind of head thing you're wearing, how much it's round and sort of therefore your whole, And this is generally true about superheroes. Superman has to go through a kind of like a Spider-Man phase, has to go through a powerless phase of figuring out his ways. You have to invert the thing that makes him Superman. And that is a bunch of the most important and meaningful Superman runs, where he has no powers. Now what's he going to do? For any of the reasons. Or more often than not, and more meaningfully than not, where Superman succeeds and triumphs and becomes a menacing, terrifying force. This is the slope that began to emerge very naturally in the Zack Snyder Superman, where he starts out, an immigrant like anybody else, and just the whole virtue is his unwillingness to embrace the like nationalism of Mars, that his enemy, played by Michael Shannon, who notably I associate him with the FBI guy from Boardwalk Empire forever. I think that's really the role that got him across. And similarly awful, the FBI guy from The Color of Water, even worse in a lot of ways, right? At least the one from Boardwalk Empire sort of, became a gangster. He just kind of flipped. But the one from The Color of Water, the Creature of the Black Lagoon one, right? Same Fed. And in Man of Steel, and even into The Flash, right? The same guy, and even constantly reincarnated in the Zack Snyder canon, right? That's who they make their Doomsday out of for that Superman Batman film that sort of gave a lot of hope to the franchise, but actually made clear how much it would never be good and could never be resonant as human. Like, I really think Justice League was a little cursed by how awful Superman versus Batman was. And here we're going to talk about it. Superman versus Batman. Nope. Superman as opposed to Batman. Oh, like, here's what I mean. They're kind of the opposite thing, and they have no natural reconciliation. Like, does Wonder Woman count as a natural conciliation between Superman and Batman? Sure. Does Spider-Man count as a natural conciliation between Superman and Batman? I don't know. I mean, like, if and when kids need to list 3 superheroes, it's one direction and the other. And maybe this is less true nowadays. Maybe Ben 10 is or maybe something is successful now on the level of Superman and Batman. Maybe there's something on the level of that together. And I think, yes, Spider-Man or Wonder Woman, depending on who's talking, what we mean, it might be very gendered. And this relationship to gender divides is really the spectrum that gives way to the very strong difference, because there's, gender spectrums, and thus the marketing that the different companies use to sell dolls with like real combable hair in one direction and dolls with like thick plastic pieces that are in the shapes of weapons in the other direction, as was the polarity in my childhood with like He-Man and She-Ra, where that was somehow the strong but soft distinction, despite sharing a universe, right? And I think this is also the history of ancient religion within empires. How does a pantheon narrative form? The easiest materialistic explanation, besides just familial unfolding drama, besides for that, is the spectrum of neighborhoods, within an empire, spectrum of cities, states, and policies. And what is their dynamic? Let's say if they're friendly, great. But why are you over there and I'm over here, right? Like, oh, you guys are closer to the river and I'm closer to the road, right? You guys are a little further up in the mountains. We're a little embedded and in complete control of the valleys, right? We just have a valley strategy. That just means the valley belongs to us, or these mountains do. Or the valleys are commons, And I think that is the idea of the public domain with characters. Let's say if there were no owned characters, if there were no companies owning characters, we'd still have companies making stories. They would all just be doing their own version of like Julius Caesar or Sherlock Holmes, or just the big characters. You can just keep doing Jesus. I guess it's hard to tell new stories about Muhammad. I guess, there's less of a market for Muhammad comics for some reason. But which is, I think, part of why you do have adaptive characters who become like the role of the prophet, but through time. And this is, famously Elijah for us, and El Khadir, and like all the Taoist immortals, everyone who can appear and recur in and through a story. Let's say the original diagnostic science of religion in Hellenistic or Babylonian context is just to tell you what kind of God you're worshiping. Because, you could just call him Quasar or Blabambab. But let's say you're dealing with a wider world, with a wider set of language for their divinities. But it turns out Blism Blasm is functionally identical, at least as far as cult, at least as far as how he's being worshipped, to Jezebaz, some completely distantly related and maybe not even directly related divinity character, worshipped, figure. But the impulse to do the same things is the same. Like, let's say, I think this is the issue with agriculture. And a lot of why we assumed for so long that early religion developed around agriculture was because agriculture comes with an inherent ritual experience that anyone who's handling the grain will experience. Everyone who's handling the grain and sort of doing a sort of refinement process will understand a theology and a sort of angelic hierarchy and a sort of monomyth tragedy that just relates to, boy, we're all shucking wheat all day. Shucking wheat sure is hard on the hands. Doesn't that explain why the hands of God are blah, 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 blah. And this comes up especially in the summer solstice, which is so identified. And I'd say the entire moon cycle that follows, so identified, Cancer with Tammuz. It's called Tammuz in the old Middle Eastern languages, still is in like Iran, Temez, It's the fourth moon paralleling Cancer, the crab, as it were. And I really associate this phenomena with the repressed frustration against any kind of Apollonian terrifying perfection expressed as Gemini. I don't want to get too technical here, but why is the AI called Gemini, right? Why is every company that's called Gemini calling itself Gemini? What a strange thing to identify with. They don't call themselves Aries or like you can call yourself like, Capricorn. Why do they call themselves Gemini? Because Gemini has always been understood tacitly as a solar perfectionistic figure. Now, I think the joke of the AI Gemini is it's you and me, right? The two twins in Gemini are you and me, who are one whole entirely encompassed humanity, which is why there is a universalism to sun worship as well as to science and math. There's a universalism to them because they offer to be the sun that we all live under. And this is, I think, a basic monomythology of Gemini, why it's expressed as twin humans who are Hercules and Apollo in most narrative inversions. But the rejection of this, because every next step in the cycle is a rejection of the extreme of the other. That's why it's gone a different direction. The moon, I should say, waxes and wanes. And when it wanes is when it loses interest in functioning in the same capacity that it has functioned and moves on to the next. Superheroes, similarly, constantly give up on who they are because they don't exist, because they are constructed by companies who are working with what they think you'll want to see. Based on what you want to see is what a company wants to give you. And thus, the history of idolatry, the history of religion, and the history of media is some kind of an aspirational pander game. It's like, hey, you like circus guys? Circus guy in front of a thing. Circus guy on front of a thing. Or something more realistic. And this is a little bit the scale of the reboot. Now, not a lot of the same writers or artists can relate to both Superman and Batman. Only a few really have. And it's often been more about responsibility commercially just to climb to the top of what you can get paid for. because these are cushy gigs. If you're doing an official Superman or Batman thing, oh, good, you got paid. Now, it used to be you could sell your own and make your own money as much as the one they're selling, but there's a different distribution modality that sort of is the world now, you know. And as much as the internet offered to reassociate that, movies and TV shows are still a bigger thing. The distribution still very much has to belong to the deeply familiar. And even if someone is not doing Superman as Superman, they can just call him something else. You know, like James Gunn before this gig did a Superman thing. I forget what it's called. It's like Flyover or something, but it was what if Superman is just a big problem? You know, it's a very important meditation, you know. What if the whole thing that was good about the romance and the fun of the character, what if you encountered how bad it actually was? Because power corrupts. And this is very much the narrative of The Boys, right? Homelander is Superman, but you don't want to be rescued by that kind of Superman because there's no accountability to Superman except for his heart. And so the main thing that's romanticized within Superman is actually less his capacity to do things, but more where his heart actually is. And this is why Superman, over the last, I'd say 30, 40 years, has mostly been about romance. Like, let's say, Lois Lane just relieved to have a good guy. And this is the overlap between Superman and Batman that was acknowledged very publicly, I'd say, as early as the 50s, but certainly was a big part of the best overlap incarnations of them together, which I would say I would leave Super Friends out of it. Super Friends, they don't seem to really relate to each other at all. They're just a bunch of stars on the screen, and they're functioning as a traditional pantheon. It's sort of like you go this way, I'll take care of this, you'll take care of that. Skidabam boom, Justice League forever. But Superman and Batman interpretations, I think the most fleshed out and the most meaningful culturally was the animated series that came out. Now, contrast the success and failure of the Batman and Superman animated series with how close we came to a Tim Burton directed Superman film, which I think we can all acknowledge with the insight and information we now have from history would have been awful. Like, mostly because he probably would not have stayed reliably on script with Kevin Smith's script, and that was presumably why he didn't do it. But also, Tim Burton has been outed as just kind of having one idea that he can do. It's just loner, just frustrated creative loner. I had a fun thought about Edward Scissorhands in the context of Azamra. You know, I will cut away the theology of the loner who has a capacity to see through and cut through, which is very much the eagle aspect on the chariot. And generally kind of the point where superheroes become obnoxious. Let's say part of the virtue and success of the Tim Burton characters, including his Batman, but certainly including his Edward Scissorhands and all his Johnny Depps, every single Johnny Depp that Tim Burton has ever deployed, is basically kind of a lunar figure, alienated and distant. I'm having trouble thinking of an exception, and the closest exception within Tim Burton's canon I can think of is Big Eyes, which was brightly lit, very Florida-based, and about an alienated loner who didn't really want to be an alienated loner. She was being taken advantage of. Guy was getting her to produce art that he was making money from. Now, notice how meaningful and ironic that particular conflict is in the stealing of Superman, more than Batman, but as much as Batman, away from their creators to be company characters that will benefit the distribution network, which was built for comics in the first place, you know, the paper barons. The paper barons. You know who I learned this from was Stephen Grant wrote a great article about for High Times about how marijuana prohibition and comic books, the thing they have in common is they both grew out of the paper barons. Paper distribution was a huge industry, and you could sell that paper if you got stuff on it people wanted to buy, you know, pictures, stories. And this was the Hearst Corporation. This was the entire reason hemp was made illegal, right? Was just the paper and wood interests trying to sell themselves. How true can that be? Right? It's an interesting myth within the subculture, let's say, that like functions within economic history. And Batman is more rooted in the classic pulp model than Superman is. Even calling it pulp acknowledges how much it used to be about just selling paper, just unloading paper, just too much paper, make some money out of it. Paper itself is basically made of wood surplus. You know, they're really making lumber stuff. They're really doing all those like, you know, toothpicks and things. And the extra becomes paper. And then the extra paper becomes sold as something. Toilet paper? No, not as interesting or important to people, not as central to how people identify and become. Educational materials really become the main pivot of paper. You can get the most money for it because schools have to exist. And education itself depends on superheroes, which sounds absurd, but notice how much these things wind up overlapping. Histories, literatures, wrap themselves around iconic figures of some kind because that's who you put on the cover of things. Now, when you have an orthodox religion ruling over a place, they determine who those figures are, which saints get to be put on which covers of which books and when, what the heraldry is. But when it's a market thing, it's really about listening to what the kids appreciate. And Superman developmentally is a much cleaner moment for the self and for the extended child community being marketed to than Batman is. But Batman is more popular because we have so much more tension. Hold on. Trying to turn the thing off. Hold on, Lara. Just need to turn the thing off 1 second.